Before we begin tonight, I want you to do something for me. Close your eyes for just a moment, or keep them open, whichever feels more comfortable, and think about the last thing you ate. Not a grand meal, maybe something simple, something grabbed quickly, or warmed up in 2 minutes, or pulled from a bag on your way home. Think about what it tasted like, whether it was sweet or salty, or a little bit of both. Think about how easy it was to get, how you didn't have to grow it, or hunt it, or spend 3 days preserving it just to make it last through the week. How it was simply there, waiting for you, as it always is. Hold on to that feeling, because I'm going to take it from you tonight. Not forever, just for the next hour or so. I'm going to walk you through a world where that kind of ease was unimaginable, where the question of what to eat was not a matter of preference or convenience or mood, but a matter of survival, solved differently every single day, usually badly, and sometimes fatally. I'm going to tell you the true story of food in medieval Europe, not the version you see in films, with cheerful peasants raising clay cups and laughing around a fire. Not the version from the history books, which tends to move quickly past the uncomfortable parts. The real version. The version with cold fingers and empty stomachs, and bread that could, in the wrong year, in the wrong field, quietly drive an entire village insane. It is not a comfortable story, but here is what I can promise you. Somewhere in the middle of it, perhaps without even noticing, you will feel something shift. The weight of your own blanket will feel different. The warmth of the room around you will feel earned somehow, as if you have come to understand, for the first time, what warmth actually means to a body that has known what it is to be without it. That is the gift of this particular kind of history. And so, let's begin. Dim whatever lights are still on. Set your phone down. Face down or face up, it doesn't matter. You won't be needing it for a while. Let the sounds of wherever you are tonight, the traffic, the hum of appliances, the low murmur of the building settling around you, let all of that begin to recede. You don't need to sleep yet. You don't need to do anything at all. Just listen. Imagine waking up hungry, not the gentle, manageable hunger of someone who skipped a snack, not even the sharp, irritable hunger of someone who worked through lunch. Something older than that. Something that has been building for days, that sits in the hollow of your ribs like a stone, that colors every thought and sharpens every sound, and makes the word food feel less like a category and more like a prayer. You are lying on straw. The straw is damp. The cold of the stone floor beneath it has worked its way up through the material and into your hip, your shoulder, the side of your face. It is not the cold of a room with a thermostat set too low. It is the cold of a building that was never designed to be warm, that has gaps between its stones where the wind finds its way through, that has a fire only when someone has had the energy and the wood to light one. This morning, no one has. It is somewhere in the early decades of the 14th century. You are a peasant, or rather, you are inside the experience of one, feeling what they felt, beginning the same day they began every day. And the first task of that day before anything else is the same as it was yesterday and the day before and every day before that within living memory, finding enough to eat. Historians use the phrase subsistence economy to describe the world you've just woken up into. It is a tidy academic term for something far messier in practice. The daily arithmetic of keeping a human body running on the narrowest possible margins in a system with almost no safety net, no refrigerator, no corner shop, and no government agency to call when things go wrong. When things went wrong in medieval Europe, they went wrong completely. And they went wrong for everyone in the village at once. The pottage pot from yesterday still sits by the cold hearth. Pottage, which is to say, a thick soup of whatever could be found and boiled, was the central food of the medieval peasant's life in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. It was breakfast and often dinner. It was what you ate when you had something to eat. It was made with oats or dried peas or onions or leeks or old root vegetables going soft at the edges, or any combination of the above, cooked until everything lost its individual identity and became something unified and gray and hot. On a genuinely good day, there was a bone in it, not for the marrow, which had long since been extracted, but for the ghost of flavor it still faintly contributed after its fourth or fifth boiling. Nothing was thrown away, not a skin, not a stem, not a scrap of bread gone hard as a roof tile. In a household where the difference between eating and not eating could come down to a single bad week of weather, waste was not an option. It was not a virtue either, in the sense of something you had to remind yourself to practice. It simply did not exist as a concept. There was nothing to waste, because everything that existed was already, in some sense, essential. This is the foundation of the world we are entering, a world in which food was not a pleasure, not a hobby, not a form of self-expression. It was the central problem of existence, and the central project of life was solving it imperfectly, repeatedly, day after day. Here is one of the great quiet cruelties of medieval life. The very things that could have made it bearable were, for the vast majority of people, completely beyond reach. We are talking about spices. Walk through any modern supermarket and you will pass them without a second glance. Little jars arranged on a rack, unremarkable, affordable, the most modest items in the aisle: cinnamon, black pepper, cloves, nutmeg, things you shake out of a container on a Wednesday evening without thinking about it. In medieval Europe, this casual relationship with spice would have been incomprehensible. The same black pepper that sits on your kitchen counter was, in the 13th and 14th centuries, a commodity so valuable that its price was measured not against the cost of other foods, but against the cost of other assets. In England, around 1280, a pound of pepper, roughly the amount a modern household uses over several months, cost 12 pence. An agricultural laborer in that same period earned somewhere between 1 and 2 pence per day, which means that a single pound of pepper represented, for the man hauling stones or turning soil or cutting peat, nearly 2 full weeks of labor, 2 weeks of his body spent for seasoning. Ginger was comparable in price, cinnamon worse, and saffron, the most labor-intensive spice in the world, produced by harvesting the 3 tiny stigmas from the inside of a particular crocus flower by hand at the precise moment of blooming, requiring more than 200,000 flowers to yield a single pound of finished spice. Saffron, in 14th century England, cost between 12 and 15 shillings per pound. To give you a sense of scale, a good quality cow could be purchased at the time for roughly 10 shillings. Saffron cost more, pound for pound, than livestock. These were not local products. They came from the other side of the world through supply chains so long and complicated that the people who consumed them had essentially no idea where they had originated. Pepper grew along the Malabar coast of southwestern India, in forests so dense and distant that the average European had more chance of visiting the moon. Cinnamon came from the island the medieval world knew as Serendip, the paradise island at the edge of the known map, now called Sri Lanka. Cloves and nutmeg came from a scattering of tiny volcanic islands in what is now Indonesia, places so remote that even the Arab and Persian merchants who traded in their products often worked through layers of intermediaries, carefully ensuring that no one else could trace the supply back to its source and cut them out of the transaction. The journey that brought a sack of pepper from a forest in Kerala to a kitchen in London was, by the standards of the time, almost miraculous in its complexity. Sea voyage to the Persian Gulf or Red Sea, overland caravan across the deserts of the Middle East, subject to bandits, drought, and the political instabilities of a dozen different kingdoms. Maritime crossing of the Mediterranean, dependent on the goodwill of the Italian city-states, primarily Venice and Genoa, that had established near total control over European access to these goods, and whose merchants had no particular interest in making spices affordable for ordinary people. At each stage of this journey, the price rose. At each border, a toll. At each port, a commission. By the time the pepper reached a market in Northern Europe, it had changed hands so many times and traveled so far that its final price bore almost no relationship to its original cost. It had become, in a very literal sense, worth its weight in something close to silver. So valuable were these spices that they were used as currency in their own right. Rents were collected in peppercorns. Fines were paid in ginger. Guild memberships were purchased, in some cities, partly with spices rather than coin. And in one of history's most striking illustrations of the commodity's value, in September of 480 AD, when the Visigoth king Alaric encircled Rome and demanded a ransom to lift his siege of the city, his terms included 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. He wanted spice alongside precious metals, because in the calculus of that world, they were roughly equivalent in their desirability. All of this took place, of course, at the highest levels of society. For the peasant grinding barley into coarse flour, the spice trade was as relevant to daily life as the weather on the moon. What seasoned the pottage on her hearth was whatever grew within walking distance. Wild garlic, bitter and pungent, foraged at the edge of the field. Nettles, which added a faint green note and a certain sting if handled carelessly, Mustard seed, pressed into a rough paste? Vinegar, sharp and cheap, which could at least cut through the gray flatness of boiled grain and make the mouth feel something other than nothing. These were the flavors of poverty, not terrible in their way. Wild garlic is actually quite good, but desperately limited. And no combination of foraged herbs could do what even a pinch of pepper did at a noble table: transform preserved meat from barely tolerable to genuinely appetizing, make a dish of dried fish smell of something other than salt and age, give bread a complexity that invited a second bite. The absence of spice in the peasant's kitchen was not merely an inconvenience. It was a sensory reminder, built into every meal, of exactly where they stood in the world. So if spice was out of reach, what did the vast majority of medieval Europeans actually eat? The honest answer is grain, endlessly, in various forms. Historians estimate that somewhere between 70 and 80% of the total caloric intake of a medieval peasant came from grain-based foods: bread, porridge, flat cakes, grain-thickened soups. It was the alpha and omega of daily nutrition. It kept bodies alive. It fueled the labor that produced more grain. And it was, very often, deeply unpleasant. The white bread that graced noble tables, soft, leavened, made from fine-milled wheat flour, was not simply a food in medieval society. It was a status symbol, as explicit as a coat of arms. The whiteness of bread correlated directly with the quality of the grain used and the care taken in its milling. White bread meant you were eating well. It meant you had money, and it was, accordingly, not for everyone. In certain parts of medieval Europe, laws actually restricted the consumption of fine white wheat bread to the upper classes, not because anyone was particularly worried about nutrition, but because the visible markers of social distinction were considered important enough to codify in statute. For the peasant majority, bread was a different thing entirely. Darker, denser, heavier, made from rye or barley or a mixture of both. Grains that were cheaper, hardier in northern European climates, and nutritionally adequate if unexciting. In lean years, when grain ran short, this bread might be extended with dried peas, ground beans, or, in the worst situations, acorn flour, which produced a loaf so bitter and astringent that eating it was an act of desperation rather than nourishment. This bread staled quickly. Within a day or two of baking, it had gone from merely dense to genuinely difficult, requiring real effort to chew, and posing a genuine risk to teeth that were already compromised by a lifetime of coarse, gritty food. Peasants ate it anyway, dunked in pottage to soften it, gnawed at the edges when nothing else was available, because throwing away food, as we have established, was not an option. There is a particular medieval practice that illustrates this relationship with bread in a way that stays with you once you've encountered it. The trencher. A trencher was a thick slab of stale bread, typically 4 or more days old, used as a plate. Food was piled on top of it, juices and gravy soaked through over the course of the meal. At a noble table, the soggy trencher at meal's end might be tossed to the servants or to the dogs. At a peasant table, It was eaten. It was part of the meal. It was not a secondary course or a bonus. It was simply the final and most economical act in a transaction that began with the first bite and ended when there was nothing left to consume. The image of eating your own plate at the end of dinner sounds, to modern ears, like the gimmick of an expensive novelty restaurant. In 1320, it was Tuesday. Alongside bread, the great constant was pottage, that endlessly variable, never particularly exciting thick soup that formed the backbone of nearly every meal. In a good summer, with a garden producing, pottage could contain real vegetables: cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, dried beans. It might even have herbs, which gave it color and a suggestion of flavor. In winter, it was whatever had been preserved: salted roots, dried pulses, the occasional scrap of smoked something. Good pottage, made by a household with enough, was actually reasonably nutritious, genuinely filling, warm, and capable of sustaining hard physical labor. Bad pottage in a household struggling through a difficult season was hot gray water with ambitions. Dairy products existed, but were unreliable. A family with a cow had theoretical access to milk, butter, and cheese. In practice, cattle required winter fodder, which required a good harvest to produce, which was not guaranteed. In lean years, the cow ate last, sickened first, and produced least. Eggs were similar, plentiful in spring when the days lengthened, scarce in the depths of winter when chickens laid less reliably, and valuable enough in either season to represent a real asset rather than a casual breakfast. The nutritional picture that emerges from all of this is of a diet just barely adequate to sustain life. Calorie dense, but micronutrient poor. Filling but monotonous. Technically survivable, but with essentially no margin for error. No buffer against a bad harvest, a sick animal, an early frost. The food was not designed to satisfy. It was designed to keep working bodies functional until tomorrow, when the same calculation began again. But there was something worse than monotony lurking in the medieval grain supply, something invisible, incomprehensible by the knowledge of the time, and genuinely terrifying in its effects. Its name, today, is ergotism. Its medieval name was St. Anthony's fire. Claviceps purpurea is a fungus that infects rye and other cereal grains, particularly in wet summers when the grain stays damp in the field through harvest. It produces a dense, dark growth, purplish-black, dense, slightly elongated, on the grain head that could, in the uncertain light of a medieval harvest, be easily overlooked or mistaken for a full, healthy grain. When these infected grains went to the mill along with everything else, the ergot compounds entered the flour. When the flour was made into bread, the compounds entered every person who ate it. The effects were horrifying. Ergot produces alkaloid compounds that constrict blood vessels severely, cutting off circulation to the extremities with a slow, agonizing efficiency. The first symptom was burning, a sensation described consistently by survivors as fire moving through the limbs, as if the veins themselves were alight. This was followed by convulsions, by hallucinations of a vividness and terror, difficult to imagine from a safe distance, and in severe or prolonged cases, by gangrene. Not the slow surgical gangrene of a wound, the rapid total gangrene of complete vascular shutdown, fingers going black, then toes, then entire hands and feet, drying and dying while the person was still alive, and eventually simply separating from the body as though they had never truly belonged to it. Whole villages were affected simultaneously because they had all eaten from the same communal harvest. The cause was utterly invisible. The bread looked normal. It had been made precisely as bread was always made, and it was killing people who had done nothing wrong except eat what was available. The single recorded outbreak in France in 1994 CE killed between 20,000 and 40,000 people across the country. Subsequent outbreaks followed through the medieval centuries, clustering in wet years, devastating rural communities with a regularity grim enough to have its own name, its own patron saint, its own network of hospitals founded specifically to treat its victims. The Order of Hospitallers of Saint Anthony, established in 1100 CE at Grenoble, dedicated itself entirely to caring for ergotism sufferers. And by the end of the 15th century, nearly 400 affiliated hospitals operated across Europe. The walls of the original hospital at Grenoble were painted red to evoke the burning sensation experienced by those within. The peasants who brought infected grain to the mill did not know. They could not have known. The connection between the dark growths on the rye and the fire in the limbs would not be formally established until 1596, when a German physician named Wendelin Tellius made the link. For nearly 600 years before that, St. Anthony's fire was simply one more inexplicable catastrophe in a world that had many of them. A punishment from God, perhaps, a bad season, a mysterious illness. They ate the bread because they had no choice, and sometimes the bread killed them. This is the first truth about medieval food. It was not a backdrop to life, richly colored and vaguely romantic. It was the primary site of struggle, the place where the precariousness of existence expressed itself most plainly and most often. The grain that kept you alive could poison you. The harvest that filled your pottage pot could fail and leave it empty. The flavors that could have made eating a pleasure were reserved entirely and without apology for people with the money to afford them. And we have, so far, only talked about the grain. In part 2, we go further. We will follow the rarer things, meat, fish, the desperate art of preservation, through the kitchens and smokeries and salt cellars of the medieval world. We will meet the people who found unexpected ways to make the inedible edible, and the moments when even their ingenuity ran out. But for now, let that story wait. Let the weight of this first chapter settle. You are warm. The bed beneath you is soft. The food in your kitchen tomorrow will not require 6 weeks of wages to afford, and it will not, in all likelihood, set your limbs on fire. That is not a small thing. Rest with that. You are still lying on that straw mattress. The cold is still there. That particular patient cold of stone walls and a fire that has not been lit. But something has shifted slightly in the quality of the silence. The village outside is beginning to stir. You can hear it, faintly. The low sound of an animal somewhere close. The creak of a door, a child's voice cut short. The day is making its first tentative moves toward existence. And somewhere in the back of your mind, beneath the grain and the pottage and the gray sameness of it all, there is a thought, a hope, really, small and persistent as a candle in a large room. Meat. In the modern world, meat is so available that we have built entire philosophical movements around the question of whether we should eat it. We have restaurants that specialize in its absence. We have grocery aisles arranged around its alternatives. We have the luxury, in other words, of choosing not to eat something that our ancestors would have walked several miles in the rain to obtain. For the medieval peasant, meat was not a dietary category to be evaluated against alternatives. It was a dream, an occasional, precious reality that punctuated the grain-gray sameness of daily life with something that tasted like the world could be different. Most historians who have studied peasant diet in the high medieval period estimate that a working-class family ate meaningful amounts of meat, by which we mean enough to call it a meal rather than a flavoring, perhaps once or twice a week at best, and considerably less often than that during leaner times or in the depths of winter. The most democratic meat animal in medieval Europe was the pig. Pigs had specific qualities that made them the logical choice for the peasant household. They required no pasture. They could forage in woodland, root in common land, eat the scraps from the kitchen that no one else could use, vegetable peelings, stale bread, rotten fruit. They converted garbage into protein with an efficiency no other domestic animal could match. They were, in the language of agricultural economics, a near-perfect closed loop. You fed them your waste, and they gave you meat, fat, hide, and bristle in return. The killing of the household pig was one of the most significant events in the peasant calendar. It happened traditionally around the Feast of St. Martin, November 11th, as winter's grip began to tighten, and it was a moment of serious, practiced activity rather than celebration. Nothing from the pig was wasted. Nothing. The legs became hams rubbed with salt and hung to cure in the cool air of the cottage. The belly was smoked. The blood went into a mixture with grain and fat and spices if any could be found, cooked in the intestine, and eaten immediately because blood spoiled quickly. The fat was rendered into lard. The head was boiled. The offal, liver, heart, kidneys was eaten fresh that day because it would not last. The trotters were pickled. The bristles were saved for brushes. By the time the pig was fully processed, it had been transformed into something that would sustain the family through the coldest months. Dense, salty, heavily preserved parcels of protein that could be eked out, a small slice at a time, into the pottage pot or onto a piece of stale bread. The pig died in November so that the family might live through February. But a pig required care all year to reach that November moment. It required someone to watch it, feed it, make sure it didn't wander, didn't sicken, didn't become someone else's dinner before it became yours. In a world without insurance, without veterinary medicine, without the ability to simply buy another one if something went wrong. A pig was an investment, and like all investments, it could fail. Chickens and geese supplemented the picture. A few chickens in the yard produced eggs irregularly and, eventually, when they were too old to produce further, a meal of tough but genuine poultry. Geese, with their louder complaints and greater territorial aggression, were harder to keep but larger. And the goose that appeared on the medieval peasant's table at Christmas, if it appeared at all, was eaten with a reverence that had nothing ironic about it. It was eaten completely, and the fat was saved. Beyond the household animals lay something far more enticing and far more dangerous. The wild. Medieval England and France were thick with deer, boar, rabbits, hares, and game birds. Animals that moved through forests and across common land in numbers that, from a modern perspective, seem almost dreamlike. They were there, they were visible. A peasant walking to the field in the early morning could watch a deer stand motionless 20 feet away, close enough to count the lines on its flank. A boy herding geese along a woodland edge might flush a hare from the undergrowth with every other step, and almost none of it could be touched. The great forests of medieval Europe were, in the main, royal property, claimed by kings and great lords under a system of forest law that reserved the wildlife within them for the exclusive use of the nobility. This was not merely a legal technicality. It was one of the defining social realities of the age, enforced with a severity that modern readers find difficult to credit. Poaching in the royal forests was a crime that, during the early medieval period, could be punished with blinding, castration, or death. The later medieval period moderated these extremes somewhat. Punishments shifted toward fines, imprisonment, and exile. But the principle remained constant. The deer were not for you. The boar were not for you. The rabbits in the Lord's warren were not for you. The fish in the Lord's private pond were not for you. This was not a matter of practical scarcity. The forests were full. The animals were by any reasonable measure more than enough for everyone. The prohibition was a social technology, a mechanism for maintaining hierarchy through the most visceral possible reminder of who held power. The lord who could eat venison, while the peasant who had watched that same deer from 20 feet away ate pottage, had demonstrated something about the nature of their respective positions that required no further elaboration. Some peasants poached anyway. Of course they did. A man watching his children go hungry in January, with a living deer visible from his doorstep, was not going to be deterred by the theoretical threat of punishment from a lord who lived 3 days' ride away. They set snares at night, cut across woodland edges at dusk with a bow and a prayer, worked in pairs so one could watch while the other worked. And some were caught. The records of manorial courts are sprinkled with poaching cases throughout the medieval period. Names, villages, the detail of what was taken and what was paid in penalty. Ordinary people making impossible calculations between the law and hunger, and sometimes choosing wrong. If meat was the aspiration of the medieval peasant, fish was the necessity, and the distinction mattered more than it might initially seem. The Catholic Church, which organized the spiritual and, to a significant degree, the practical life of medieval Europe, mandated abstinence from meat on Fridays, on the vigils of major feasts, and through the 40 days of Lent before Easter. In total, the religious calendar of a devout medieval Christian required fish instead of meat on more than half the days of the year. This was not a suggestion. It was a dietary law with genuine moral weight, observed from the peasant's cottage to the royal palace. And it created a demand for fish that shaped trade routes, founded cities, and drove one of the largest commercial operations in the medieval world. The fish that fed this demand was, above all, herring. Herring came in vast seasonal schools through the waters of the North Sea and the Baltic, arriving in numbers that were, by the standards of the time, almost incomprehensible. In the late summer and autumn, the herring ran along the coast of what is now southern Sweden, in particular, around the town of Falsterbo and the Scanian Peninsula, in quantities so enormous that chroniclers describe the sea itself as appearing to thicken with them. So dense were the shoals. Boats could be filled in hours. The catch was staggering. The problem was what happened next. Herring is an oily fish that spoils within hours if not preserved. The transformation of this extraordinary seasonal abundance into something that could feed the whole of Northern Europe through a winter required an industrial operation of remarkable sophistication. Huge quantities of salt, an army of workers, mostly women, gutting and packing fish with practiced speed, barrels built to specific specifications, ships designed to carry as many barrels as possible, and a network of commercial relationships that made the whole system function. The organization that came to control this network was the Hanseatic League, a commercial alliance of Northern European trading cities that by the 14th century had established something close to a monopoly on the Baltic herring trade. The League sent its own ships for salt from the Bay of Bourneuf on the Atlantic coast of France, shipped that salt north to the herring grounds, oversaw the packing and barreling, and distributed the finished product across a continent. It was one of the most significant commercial operations of the medieval world, built on the back of a small silver fish that spent most of its life in cold northern water. The herring that eventually appeared in a peasant household had traveled far and been transformed almost beyond recognition, packed in barrels with dense layers of salt between each layer of fish. It had cured for weeks or months into something dense, chewy, intensely salty, and possessed of a smell that registered immediately and decisively in any room it entered. Before eating, it required soaking, sometimes for an entire day, to draw out enough salt to make it palatable. The soaking water had to be changed multiple times. The result was still quite salty, still quite chewy, still, in honest terms, an acquired taste. But it was protein, reliable, affordable, preserved, and available throughout the year. For peasant communities far from the coast, salted herring was often the only fish they would ever eat, and it was eaten without complaint because the alternative was eating nothing at all. Alongside herring, cod was preserved differently. dried without salt in the cold, dry winds of Norway and Iceland into something called stockfish. Rigid, pale planks of protein, so thoroughly desiccated that they could be stored for months or even years without spoiling. Before eating, stockfish required days of soaking and vigorous beating with a wooden mallet to return it to something with the texture of food. The process was labor-intensive, and the result was, to put it gently, an acquired taste. But stockfish was cheap, portable, qualities that made it one of the most important trade goods of the medieval world, carried in the holds of Hanseatic ships to every corner of northern and central Europe. For those who could afford better, or rather, for those who didn't need to afford anything at all, there was a different category of fish entirely. Carp, pike, and perch, raised in the elaborate fish ponds maintained on noble estates, were delicate, fresh, and completely inaccessible to the average person. These ponds were investments, stocked and managed with genuine care, protected by the same laws that protected the deer in the forest. A carp from a noble pond arrived at a noble table, same day, fresh, poached in wine, or spiced with costly aromatics, plated with the kind of care that transformed eating into theater. The salt, stiff herring soaking in a bucket 3 miles away was technically the same category of food. The two things had almost nothing else in common. Behind all of this, the salted herring, the cured pork, the dried beans, the pickled onions, lay the great invisible labor of medieval food, preservation. In a world without refrigeration, the window between food and poison was short and unforgiving. Anything that had been killed, harvested, or caught began its decline immediately. The medieval cook, or the medieval housewife, who was in most households the person managing the food supply, operated under a constant pressure that we have almost entirely forgotten. The pressure of time. Everything needed to be either eaten quickly or preserved, and preservation required resources that were not always available. Salt was the most important preservative in the medieval world, and its supply was treated with the seriousness we now reserve for oil. The great salt-producing regions of Europe, the Bay of Bourneuf on the Atlantic coast, the salt mines of Lüneburg in northern Germany, the salt marshes of the Mediterranean coast, were strategic assets, their control worth fighting over, their output essential to the functioning of the entire food economy. Without salt, the preserved fish and meat that sustained people through winter could not exist. Salt was not a seasoning, it was infrastructure. Smoking was slower but effective. The combination of dehydration and chemical compounds in wood smoke inhibited bacterial growth and gave the food a flavor that, unlike the aggressive saltiness of brine-cured products, was genuinely appealing. A good smoked ham, hanging in the rafters of a cottage where cooking fires kept the air perpetually dry, could last through an entire winter. Pickling in vinegar, another acid environment hostile to bacterial growth, preserved vegetables that the garden produced in summer abundance for consumption in the months when nothing grew. Cabbage was shredded and fermented with salt into a sour, dense preserve. Cucumbers, onions, and root vegetables went into crocks of vinegar. Dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils were stored in cool, dark conditions for months or years, waiting to be the primary protein in a winter pottage. And in wealthy households, honey. Honey is one of nature's most effective natural preservatives. Its low water content and acidic pH make it essentially inhospitable to microorganism growth. Fruits packed in honey could last indefinitely and emerge tasting of summer even in the depths of January. But honey was expensive, and the fruits preserved in it were accordingly luxuries. The peasant who wanted something sweet in February ate nothing sweet in February. Here is a scene. It is early morning in a medieval market town, somewhere in England, around 1300. The bakers have already been at work for hours. Baking required pre-dawn fire management, and the first loaves are ready before most of the town has woken up. They are arranged in a stall. Round loaves, brown, plausibly solid, priced according to the current cost of grain. In the back of his shop, the baker, call him Thomas or John, it doesn't matter, is kneading a second batch of dough. Into it, working quickly and with the practiced movements of someone who has done this many times, he folds a small quantity of chalk, ground fine, white, almost indistinguishable from flour at a casual glance, and useful in exactly one way. It adds weight. The loaf will feel the right heft in the hand. It will pass the quick assessment of a hurried buyer, and Thomas will have used a little less flour to produce the same apparent product. Chalk was one of the more benign adulterants. Ground dried peas were another, cheaper than wheat flour, denser, and capable of extending a batch of dough by a measurable percentage, without being immediately obvious in the finished loaf. In the worst cases, in the periods of genuine grain shortage when flour itself became scarce, the adulterants were more serious. Ground acorns, which gave bread a bitter, astringent quality and provided almost no nutritional value. Sawdust, which provided no nutritional value whatsoever and could cause real digestive harm. And, in extreme cases, substances so obviously inert that their presence speaks to a level of desperation that is genuinely difficult to contemplate. The practice was not the behavior of uniquely unscrupulous individuals. It was widespread, consistent, and driven by economics that were entirely comprehensible. Grain prices fluctuated constantly, tied to harvest outcomes that no one could predict or control. The price at which bread was sold was regulated by law, fixed, or at least constrained by the statutes that attempted to make bread affordable for the poor. The baker, caught between a rising grain price and a legally constrained loaf price, had very limited options. He could absorb the loss, which he could rarely afford. He could reduce the size of the loaf, which was illegal, or he could maintain the size while reducing the amount of flour, which was also illegal, but harder to detect. Many chose the third option. The law that attempted to prevent this was called the Assize of Bread and Ale, enacted under King Henry III in 1266, the first piece of legislation in English history to regulate the production and sale of food. It was a remarkably detailed document for its era. establishing the weight of a farthing loaf in direct relationship to the current price of wheat, and specifying the punishments available to enforcers who found violations. Those punishments were designed to be both painful and spectacular. A baker found selling underweight bread faced, for a first offense, a fine. For repeat violations, the consequences escalated sharply. The baker might be placed in the pillory, the wooden frame that locked a person's head and hands in a public square, and left there for several hours while the community made its displeasure felt by throwing whatever came to hand. In London, offending bakers were sometimes sentenced to the hurdle. The guilty party was strapped to a wooden frame and dragged through the streets of the city, the defective loaves tied around their neck, so that every neighbor and customer could see exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. This ritual public humiliation, the parade of shame through the market streets, the bread bouncing against the baker's chest, the crowd lining the route, was not arbitrary cruelty. It was a statement of principle. The bread supply was too important to cheat, and anyone who cheated it would be made an example in the most visible, memorable way possible. And yet, cheating continued, because the assize could only be enforced when someone actually checked, and checking required inspectors, and inspectors could be avoided, bribed, or simply overwhelmed. The market court records of English towns throughout the 13th and 14th centuries are peppered, almost monotonously, with the names of bakers convicted under the assize, the fine paid, the infraction noted, the loaf weight recorded. The same names appear again and again across the years. The same fines, the same short pause in operations, followed by the same resumption of the same practices. There is something almost sympathetic about this pattern, not for the cheating, but for the economics that drove it. These were not wealthy men engineering elaborate frauds. These were small operators squeezed between a grain market they could not control and a price ceiling they could not exceed, making the calculation that a little chalk in the dough was preferable to bankruptcy. But there is an interesting wrinkle in this story, a consequence of the assize that accidentally produced one of the most durable phrases in the English language. To avoid the risk of being caught with an underweight loaf, many bakers began adding an extra loaf to every dozen they sold, 13 instead of 12, so that if an inspector weighed the batch and found one loaf short, the others would compensate. The insurance loaf, the safety loaf, the baker's dozen, 13 items sold as 12, is still the phrase we use today for any small surplus added as a precaution. It is, at its origin, a story about the fear of public humiliation in a medieval market square, preserved intact in language for 7 centuries. And then there was ale. In the medieval world, ale was not primarily a recreational drink. It was a dietary staple, consumed by men, women, and children throughout the day, from morning to evening, in quantities that would seem alarming by modern standards. A laboring man might drink several pints over the course of a working day. Children were given small ale, a weaker brew made from the second or third runoff of the mashing process, because the alternative was not available. The alternative was water. And water in a medieval town or village was genuinely dangerous. There was no understanding of germ theory in the Middle Ages, no concept of bacteria, no awareness that human and animal waste contaminating a water source could produce illness in the people who drank from it. What people did know, from long empirical observation, was that some water made you sick and some didn't, that wells near certain places were safer than rivers running through towns, and that ale, whatever its other qualities, seemed to keep people alive in a way that river water did not. The brewing process, which involved boiling the wort before fermentation, killed most of the pathogens that would otherwise have been present. Even weak ale, with its modest alcohol content, maintained an environment less hospitable to harmful bacteria than standing water. So ale was drunk constantly, not for pleasure primarily, for survival. The women who produced it, alewives, were among the most important food producers in medieval society, operating from home breweries that supplied their immediate neighborhood with a product that was, quite literally, a public health intervention. Alewives are a recognizable figure in medieval records, independent, commercially active, often the primary economic operator in a household. They appear in court records, in guild documents. In literature, they are depicted in illuminated manuscripts going about their work. They were essential. They were also, like the bakers, subject to regulation under the assize of bread and ale. And like the bakers, they sometimes cheated. Watering down ale was the most common infraction. Adding water to the finished brew to increase volume and profit at the cost of a thinner, more acidic product that satisfied neither thirst nor hunger as effectively as the real thing. An alewife convicted of selling adulterated ale faced similar public penalties to the dishonest baker. The pillory, the public humiliation, the damage to a reputation in a community small enough that everyone knew everyone's name and everyone's business. The ale conner, a genuine medieval official appointed in English towns to taste and evaluate ale, was the enforcement arm of the system, armed with a specific testing method that involved sitting in a small quantity of ale poured onto a wooden bench and observing whether the bench stuck to his leather trousers after a set period, a measure of sugar content that indicated whether the brew had been properly fermented. The ale conner moved through markets and taverns with the particular authority of a man who could make your afternoon very unpleasant. It is a peculiar image, a municipal employee in leather trousers sitting in puddles of ale in the service of public health regulation. And yet, the ale conner existed, was paid for his work, and was taken seriously enough to be written into the laws of English towns for centuries. This, then, is the full picture of what was in the medieval diet beyond the grain. Meat rare, precious, hedged by law and luck. Fish abundant in theory but barely recognizable after its journey through salt and brine. Bread extended with chalk and sawdust by men who had no better option. Ale, that was safer than the alternative, but only if it hadn't been watered down. Every level of the food supply, from field to table, operated under a pressure that modern food systems have almost entirely removed. Not the pressure of inconvenience or limited choice, the pressure of genuine physical need. the kind that makes dishonesty comprehensible, that makes a bone boiled for the 5th time a rational decision, that makes you drink ale for breakfast without thinking twice. In Part 3, we go inside the places where this food was prepared and consumed, and what we find there will explain, perhaps more than anything else, why medieval life was so persistently short. We will walk through the kitchens, the streets, the great halls, and the spaces in between, and we will see what happened when everything we've described above was brought together in conditions that made the food itself seem, by comparison, almost safe. But that is for later. For now, let the weight of this part settle. Notice how still the room is around you. Notice how clean the air is. How the water you drank today required no particular courage. Rest with that. You are doing very well. We need to talk about where food was prepared, not the gleaming kitchens of the imagination, the warm, stone-flagged rooms with bundles of herbs hanging from beamed ceilings and a cheerful fire under a broad hearth. The real places, the actual physical environments in which medieval food moved from raw to cooked, from harvest to table, from alive to eaten, because understanding those environments explains, more than almost anything else we have discussed so far, why medieval life was so reliably short and so frequently painful. To understand the medieval kitchen, you need to first understand the medieval home. And to understand that, you need to understand something about animals. In the modern world, the idea of sharing your living space with livestock is, for most people, either an amusing rural fantasy or an unthinkable imposition. Animals live outside in separate structures at a distance. The border between human domestic space and animal space is clear, maintained, and generally non-negotiable. In a medieval peasant household, no such border existed. Animals were kept inside the home or in structures directly attached to it, sharing walls, sharing warmth, sharing the air. For reasons that were entirely rational, a pig in a lean-to built against the cottage wall added insulation through sheer body heat. A cow in a byre connected to the kitchen meant the difference in a hard winter between an animal that survived and one that froze. Chickens roosted in the rafters. Dogs slept on the floor, their primary function being to eat whatever fell and alert the household to intruders. In the coldest regions, cattle might spend the entire winter in the same building as the family that owned them, separated by nothing more than a low partition. The waste produced by these animals went, broadly, where animals' waste goes, onto the floor. The floor of a medieval peasant cottage was typically beaten earth, covered with a layer of rushes, straw, or similar material that was supposed to be replaced regularly, but in practice accumulated over time, layer by layer, incorporating the detritus of daily life, animal droppings, food scraps, spilled liquid, shed skin and fur, into a steadily deepening mat of organic material that served as a low-grade composting system underfoot. Contemporary visitors to peasant homes, usually members of the clergy or the nobility who left written records of what they saw, described the smell with a consistency that suggests it was remarkable even by the relatively unsqueamish standards of the era. Erasmus of Rotterdam. Writing in the early 16th century but describing conditions that had changed little over the previous 2 centuries, noted that English rush floors were often not refreshed for 20 years at a time, harboring beneath their surface a mixture of beer, grease, fragments, bones, spittle, excrement of dogs and cats, and everything that is nasty. This was the floor of the room where food was prepared. The fire around which cooking happened was also the fire around which the family slept, the fire by which animals were sometimes kept warm, the fire whose smoke had nowhere to go but the room itself. Most peasant cottages had no chimney, only a hole in the thatch above, and the smoke moved upward slowly and imperfectly, filling the upper portion of the room with a low, permanent haze that settled onto every surface, including the food. Flies moved freely between the dung heap outside, the animals inside, and the pottage pot. There was no concept of cross-contamination. There was no hand-washing protocol. There was no understanding of why any of this might matter, because the invisible world of bacteria and pathogens was not merely uncharted, but literally unimaginable. The conceptual tools to think about it simply did not exist. People cooked and ate in these conditions because these were the only conditions available. They did not consider themselves to be doing anything dangerous, and some of them were fine. The human gut, subjected to persistent low-level exposure to a wide variety of pathogens, develops a degree of resilience over time. Many medieval people reached adulthood and middle age in conditions that would hospitalize a modern visitor within a week. Their immune systems were not the same as ours. They had been trained by a different environment, but many were not fine. Gastrointestinal illness was simply a feature of medieval life, so constant, so expected, so woven into the ordinary texture of daily experience that it barely registered as illness at all. The chronic diarrhea, the stomach cramps, the periodic episodes of more serious sickness, these were background noise. The ambient sound of a body processing food in conditions that made safe processing difficult. They weakened people over time. They killed children with a regularity that medieval parents accepted as one of the fundamental terms of existence. They reduced the productive capacity of adults. They shortened lives in ways that left no dramatic record, no famous death, no named outbreak, just a gradual, unrecorded drain on the vitality of communities already operating with no margin to spare. In the cities, the situation was different from the countryside, mainly in that it was worse. Medieval cities were, by the standards of any era before the 19th century, extraordinary concentrations of filth. London, Paris, Florence, the great urban centers of the medieval world, had grown far faster than any infrastructure for managing human waste, and the gap between population and sanitation was not a gap so much as a chasm. The streets of a medieval city were not merely unpaved, they were active participants in the city's waste disposal system. Household garbage went into the street. The contents of chamber pots went into the street, defenestrated from upper windows, typically with a cursory warning shout to the pedestrians below. Butchers operated in dedicated streets. The shambles were the byproducts of slaughter, blood, fat, offal, entrails. accumulated between the irregular municipal collections that were theoretically scheduled but practically erratic. Tanners processed hides using urine and dung. Dyers ran chemicals from their workshops into the drainage channels that ran down the center of the street. Horses and oxen, the primary transport animals of the urban medieval world, produced their waste continuously and copiously wherever they stood. All of this found its way, eventually, into the water supply. In London, the Thames was simultaneously the city's primary water source and its primary drainage channel. People drew drinking water from the river in the same stretches where the city's waste discharged into it. The distance between the upstream water intake and the downstream sewage outfall was in many parts of the city negotiable. Water carriers, the men who transported river water to households that could not easily access the river directly, drew from wherever was convenient, not wherever was safe, because the difference between the two was not something that could be seen or smelled reliably. Water that looked clear could be carrying pathogens invisible to the naked eye. Water that looked brown and questionable was, in a different context, sometimes fine, without germ theory, which would not arrive until the 19th century. There was no framework for understanding any of this. The medical understanding of the age held that disease was caused by miasma, bad air arising from decaying organic matter, which entered the body through the nose and mouth. This theory was not entirely wrong. Decaying organic matter does indeed produce conditions favorable to disease, but it misdirected the preventive effort. People who believed in miasma worried about smell. They burned aromatic herbs. They avoided low-lying ground. They did not, and could not have known to, boil their drinking water systematically, or build sewage systems that separated waste from water supply. The result was a city in which waterborne illness was not an occasional catastrophe, but a chronic condition. Dysentery, the catch-all medieval term for the various forms of severe intestinal illness caused by contaminated food and water, was so common it barely warranted specific mention in most chronicles. It was simply what happened when you lived in a city. It killed children routinely and adults frequently, weakening bodies already compromised by inadequate nutrition and constant physical labor. Here is a useful illustration of how democratic medieval food danger actually was, despite everything we have said about the gulf between rich and poor. In October of 1216, King John of England was traveling through the eastern counties, fighting a civil war against his own barons on one side and a French invasion on the other. He was, by any measure, not a man whose meals should have given cause for concern. He had an extensive household, a royal cook, access to the finest provisions in the kingdom, and the kind of careful service that theoretically stood between a monarch and anything as undignified as food poisoning. At some point during his journey, the precise circumstances are contested by contemporary chroniclers, who offer a variety of explanations, including overindulgence in peaches, excessive quantities of sweet cider, and, in one particularly vivid account, a deliberate poisoning. The king developed severe dysentery. He continued traveling for several days, as men in his position were expected to project strength, regardless of condition, until he reached Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire. There he stopped. There he could not continue. And on the 18th of October, 1216, King John of England died of dysentery, most historians now conclude, contracted through contaminated food or water at some point on his final journey. The richest and most powerful man in England was killed by the same invisible threat that killed peasant children every winter across his kingdom. No amount of wealth, no level of culinary sophistication, no degree of royal privilege could protect a medieval person from contaminated food, because the contamination was invisible, and the mechanisms by which it caused harm were entirely unknown. The king's cook was not careless. The king's food was not, by the standards of the time, unsafe. It simply was what all medieval food was at its most fundamental level, prepared in conditions where the connection between sanitation and health had not yet been made, and carrying accordingly the same risks that all medieval food carried. The peasant and the king ate from the same invisible danger. The peasant faced it more often with a weaker body and survived it less. But the danger itself was no respecter of crowns. The vulnerability of the medieval food supply to things entirely outside human control was demonstrated nowhere more catastrophically than in the 7 years between 1315 and 1322. It began with rain. The spring of 1315 was wet across most of Northern Europe, not merely wetter than average, but saturated, persistently, relentlessly wet in a way that turned the fields to mud before the grain had been planted, and then kept them muddy through the growing season. The grain that managed to germinate grew weakly because waterlogged soil is not productive soil. The harvest of 1315 was disastrous. Grain prices doubled. In some markets, they tripled. The poor, who spent the majority of their income on grain in good years, spent everything they had and still could not eat enough. The winter was hard. Spring 1316 brought more rain. The second harvest failed too. Now the reserves that had carried people through the first terrible year were gone, and there was nothing to replace them. What followed is difficult to read, even at 7 centuries remove. The chronicles of the period record it in language that starts controlled and becomes increasingly raw as the situation worsened. In Bristol, the city's records describe the famine year of 1315 in terms that leave nothing to the imagination. Horse meat and dog meat, the chronicle notes, was accounted good meat. The account from the same period about parents abandoning children, the abandoned children of the Great Famine, are believed to be part of the historical reality behind the story of Hansel and Gretel, describes a level of desperation that makes the word famine feel inadequate. Cattle disease arrived alongside the food shortage, killing sheep and cattle across the continent at rates that stripped communities of their draft animals as well as their meat supply. Edward II of England, the reigning king, stopped at the Abbey of St. Albans in August of 1315 and found that his entourage could not be fed. The King of England had difficulty obtaining bread. If a king could not reliably eat, what was happening to everyone else requires only a small exercise of imagination. The death rates recorded in the regions most severely affected range from 10 to 25% of the total population, not in a single dramatic event, but stretched over years. Gradual, grinding, unrelenting attrition. People who survived the first winter of the famine were weakened. Those who survived the second were weaker still. Those who made it through the third were the ones whose circumstances, luck, or physical resilience had carried them past the point where most had fallen. Europe had not fully recovered from the Great Famine when, less than 30 years later, the Black Death arrived. The plague, bubonic in its most common form, spread by the fleas of rats that thrived in exactly the conditions we have been describing, moved through a continent whose population was already malnourished, already weakened, already depleted by the years of famine and the chronic conditions of medieval urban life. It killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population over the course of the 14th century. The precise figure will never be established because the records were kept by people who were themselves dying. But the order of magnitude is not disputed. The rats that carried the fleas, that carried the plague, lived, above all, where food was stored, handled, and sold. In granaries, in bakeries, in market stalls, in the dark corners of the kitchen floor. They lived exactly where medieval peoples spent their lives. They were not exotic intruders. They were part of the background furniture of medieval food production, as familiar and unremarkable as the flies in summer and the frost in winter. Nobody thought to fear them, because nobody knew they should. And into all of this, the scarcity, the contamination, the unreliable grain, the salted fish, the adulterated bread, the church inserted an additional requirement: fast. The Catholic Church's fasting calendar in the medieval period was not, by the standards of the time, considered an imposition. It was a spiritual discipline, a form of bodily mortification that brought the flesh under the control of the Spirit, a participation in the suffering of Christ, a preparation for the joy of Easter. Monks and theologians wrote extensively and with evident enthusiasm about the spiritual benefits of hunger, voluntarily embraced the Lenten fast, the Advent fast, the Vigil fasts, before major feasts, the mandatory abstinence from meat on Fridays. These were the skeleton of the ecclesiastical year, the structure around which all other activities were arranged. In total, the religious calendar mandated some form of dietary restriction, either full fasting or abstinence from meat and sometimes dairy, on approximately 150 days of the year, more than one day in every 2. For a monk with access to a well-stocked monastery garden and cellar, this was a spiritual exercise. For a peasant already eating the minimum necessary to sustain labor, it was something else entirely. The problem was not merely the quantity, but the quality of what remained available during fast days. Meat was forbidden. Dairy was frequently forbidden. Eggs were forbidden during Lent. What was left was grain, legumes, and fish, which is to say, the monotonous baseline of peasant diet, even without restrictions, now elevated to the level of religious obligation. The pottage of Lent was indistinguishable from the pottage of any other time, except that it arrived with the additional weight of meaning. It was not merely inadequate, it was required to be inadequate. Suffering here was the point. The family, we might imagine, trying to observe Lent in this period. A peasant household in England or northern France in late winter, when food stores were at their lowest, faced this requirement at the worst possible moment of the year. Lent falls in late February and March, the hungry gap between the exhaustion of winter stores and the first new growth of spring. It was the season when the previous year's grain was nearly gone, when dried fish from the autumn market might be running low, when the garden offered nothing fresh and the cattle were giving little milk. Into this season of natural scarcity, the church placed its most demanding fast. Some people broke the fast. The records of ecclesiastical courts contain a quiet, persistent stream of cases. People found eating meat on Fridays, households that could not sustain the full Lenten restriction. The penalties were real: fines, penance, public confession. But the rate of prosecution was low relative to the likely rate of violation, because the church was not, in practice, capable of monitoring the diet of every household in Christendom. What the fast did enforce reliably was a baseline social pressure, an acknowledgement, at least in public, that this was what proper Christians did. And yet, the church was not only a burden on the medieval poor in matters of food, it was also, in a more practical sense, often the only safety net available. Monasteries maintained extensive agricultural operations, great sweeping estates of arable land, fish ponds, orchards, and gardens, managed by communities of monks and lay brothers whose lives were organized partly around the requirement to produce enough to eat. Many monasteries ran surplus, and that surplus was in line with the Christian theology of almsgiving, distributed to the poor at the gates. Doles of bread, ladles of pottage, occasional distributions of saltfish. These were not enough to transform the lives of the poor families who received them, but they were real, and in a winter of genuine shortage, they could mean the difference between managing and not managing. The great abbeys also ran hospitals for the sick and fed the patients in their care, which put them, inadvertently, in the position of providing some of the more thoughtful food preparation of the medieval world, since feeding the ill required at least some consideration of what a weakened body could tolerate. The monastery kitchen was not an ASMR-era wellness retreat, but it was, by the standards of the time, a place where someone was actually thinking about the relationship between food and human well-being. And in a world where almost no one else was doing that, it counted for something. There is one more place we need to visit before this story can properly end. One more world within the world we've been describing, a world of color and warmth and extraordinary culinary extravagance, set like a jewel in the middle of all the gray we've traversed tonight. We've spoken, often, of what the rich ate versus what the poor could not afford. But we haven't yet sat down at the table itself. In part 4, the final part, we will. We will follow a great medieval feast from the kitchen to the hall, take our place at the edge of it, and watch. And then, slowly, gently, we will let it all go. The feast and the famine both. The cold stone floors and the warm hearths. the gray pottage, and the golden banquets. We will come home. But for now, rest here in this middle place. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the history settle around you like something old and distant. You are warm. You are safe. The century you are lying in tonight was, by almost every available measure, the best one yet for a human body simply trying to survive. Carry that thought gently into sleep. We have spent most of this night in the cold, in damp cottages, in gray kitchens, in the long, slow arithmetic of hunger. We have followed the peasant through her day, felt the weight of the pottage pot, understood the mathematics of a November pig and a salted herring barrel and a loaf of bread extended with chalk by a man who had no better option. We have seen what disease looked like when no one understood disease. We have watched the rain fall for 7 years and not stop. It is time now to step into the light. Imagine entering a room you were not born to enter. The great hall of a medieval castle or manor house on a feast day was, by every standard of the era, overwhelming. The scale first, ceilings high enough to swallow sound, stone walls hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, and biblical allegories in colors, deep reds, saturated blues, greens as vivid as summer leaves, that stood in absolute contrast to the mud-gray world outside. Then the light, dozens of candles in iron holders suspended from above, their flames multiplied by polished surfaces, turning the whole room golden. Then the smell, roasting meat, wood smoke, the sharp bright note of expensive spices drifting from the kitchen, sweet wine already poured into silver cups at the high table. At the center of it all, a table of extraordinary length, covered in white linen so fine and so carefully laundered that it glowed. And on that table, food unlike anything we have described so far. The centerpiece of a great medieval feast was not about nutrition. It was theater. It was a performance of wealth so explicit and deliberate that every dish was also a statement. Look at what we have, and look at what you will never have. A whole roasted peacock, carefully skinned before cooking, and then redressed in its own iridescent feathers after. Tail fanned to full display, beak gilded in gold leaf, carried into the hall on a silver platter while trumpets sounded, a swan, white and enormous, similarly refeathered and posed with its neck in a graceful curve, brought to the table to a round of formal applause from guests who understood that they were watching money being spent in real time and found it magnificent. Between the great meat courses came the subtleties, elaborate sculptures made entirely from sugar and almond paste, shaped into castles, heraldic animals, miniature ships, scenes from scripture. Sugar, at this point in history, was nearly as expensive as the spices, arriving from the eastern Mediterranean in dense white loaves that were locked away like silver. Using it to build an edible sculpture of a unicorn, displayed to the assembled company for their admiration, and then consumed, was not merely an indulgence. It was a very specific kind of statement. We have so much of this precious thing that we can make it into art and eat the art. Spiced wines flowed freely. Hippocras, red wine strained through a fine cloth with cinnamon, ginger, and long pepper, was a feast table staple at noble households across Europe, a drink that tasted simultaneously of luxury and medicine. The spices in it, serving their original purpose of displaying wealth, had the secondary function of masking the imperfections of wine that was not always as good as the occasion demanded. Dishes arrived in waves: almond-based soups pale as cream, venison in a dark spiced sauce, delicate pastries filled with sweetened bird meat, roasted vegetables dressed with costly sauces. This was, by any measure, beautiful. There is no useful purpose in denying it. The medieval noble feast, at its finest, represented a genuine culinary achievement. Centuries of accumulated cooking knowledge, enormous resources directed toward a single goal, the kind of communal eating experience that created memory and meaning and bound together the social fabric of the ruling class with every shared dish. But it was not safe. Here is the particular irony of the medieval feast. The very extravagance that was supposed to demonstrate mastery of the world was in practice one of the most reliable ways to become seriously ill. The quantities of food involved were staggering, produced in enormous kitchen complexes by large teams, working under intense pressure, with no refrigeration, no temperature control, no understanding of the bacterial growth that occurs in cooked meat left warm for even a few hours. A great feast might involve dozens of courses served over several hours, with dishes prepared hours in advance and kept warm, or not kept warm enough, in the kitchen while earlier courses were consumed. The spices that flavored everything were genuinely useful in this context. Their antibacterial properties helped slow spoilage, and their strong flavors masked the early signs of meat beginning to turn. This was, in fact, one of the reasons spices were valued so highly by the people who could afford them, not just for taste, for the ability to make questionable meat acceptable. It was not always enough. King Henry I of England, grandfather of the same King John who died of dysentery, reportedly fell fatally ill in December of 1135 after eating a dish of lampreys at a Norman castle. Against the express advice of his physicians, the precise cause remains debated. Food poisoning from the fish itself, or from something else consumed that evening. But the pattern is consistent: a wealthy, powerful man eating the finest food available, attended by a household full of servants, dead within days of a meal. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding why the richest food sometimes killed the richest people. The working theory involved humoral imbalance, divine punishment, or in some cases, suspected poison administered by enemies. The idea that the lamprey itself, poorly preserved or improperly prepared, might have simply carried bacteria that killed a king, that the danger was invisible and democratic and utterly indifferent to rank, was beyond the conceptual vocabulary of the age. The servants who carried the dishes, the musicians who played between courses, the lesser guests seated at the lower tables eating simpler food, they watched the spectacle of the noble feast and felt, perhaps, a familiar mixture of wonder and resentment. They knew they would never sit at the high table. They knew the gilded swan was not for them. What they did not know was that the person eating the gilded swan was not in any fundamental sense safer than they were, just more elaborately at risk. There is a moment that arrives sometimes when you are deep inside a piece of history like this. It arrives quietly, without announcement. It is not dramatic. You do not need to reach for it. It simply appears somewhere between the third and fourth telling of something difficult, when the accumulated weight of what you've been carrying becomes, paradoxically, a kind of lightness. You have been in this for a while now. You know what the straw smells like when it's wet. You know the sound a pot makes when the bottom has been scraped clean for the third consecutive morning. You know what it cost in labor, in luck, in the grinding daily effort of simply remaining alive, to feed a medieval body through a medieval winter in a world that offered almost nothing by way of assistance or safety. And now you are here, lying in the place you are lying, in a temperature controlled by a device on a wall, in a bed that is soft because someone decided it should be soft and made it that way and sold it to you, and you were able to buy it with food that is still in the kitchen for tomorrow, fresh, safe, cold, waiting without ceremony or crisis. This is not a small thing. The word abundance has lost most of its meaning in the modern world through sheer repetition and familiarity. But abundance is not a natural state. It is not the default. It is the very recent, very fragile, very improbable outcome of an enormous number of solved problems. Problems that medieval people lived inside, without solutions. Every refrigerator is a solved problem. Every sealed package with a use-by date is a solved problem. Every piece of food that has traveled safely across a country without spoiling is a solved problem. Every glass of water that comes out of a tap clean is a solved problem, one that took until the late 19th century to crack, and one that billions of people on Earth today are still waiting for. The medieval peasant grinding barley flour with ergot-infected rye and hoping for the best was not stupid or unfortunate. She was a person at a particular point in history doing the best available with the knowledge and resources of her era. The gap between her kitchen and yours is not a gap in human intelligence or human worth. It is a gap in time, in accumulated knowledge, in the slow and imperfect and often brutal process by which the species figured things out. She would not recognize your kitchen. She would not recognize the things in it. She would stand in the produce aisle of any modern grocery store and feel something between bewilderment and tears. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this particular journey. The fire is low now. The great hall has emptied, its candles guttered, the tapestry still in the still air. The village outside is dark and cold, as it always is, as it always was. Somewhere in the distance, a dog is barking. Once, twice, then silence. You are very still. Let the images of this evening, the gray pottage, the salted herring, the chalk in the bread, the gilded peacock, the rain that would not stop, let them begin to soften at the edges. They don't need to stay sharp. They have already done what they came to do. They have shown you something true. Let your body be heavy now. Let the weight of the blanket register as exactly what it is: warmth You did nothing to earn except being alive in the right century. Let your breathing slow to the pace of a room that has nothing urgent left to say. The history will keep. It has kept for 700 years. It will be exactly where you left it when you wake up. You don't have to hold on to anything right now. The bed is soft. The room is warm. There is food in the kitchen. And you, unlike so many who came before you, are simply resting. Good night.